Well, hi, hello, how are you, everyone? Welcome to today's exciting episode of Flashback with Wes Britton, where you get to hear me and my co-host Karina Kansas interview stars, entertainment insiders, and entertainers from every variety from times past, present, and future. So kick back, enjoy this next hour, and thanks for stopping by.
Well, I guess one good place to start off is kind of, I guess, not exactly the very beginning, but close to it. You really got into the world of playing rock and roll because you were brought into it by your older brother, Skip, right?
That's right. I actually was recovering from a very serious car wreck when I was 16. The last day of school I picked as the day to get totally laid out for the entire summer in a hospital bed, and then almost 18 months after that on crutches and a couch. And when I'm 16 years old and you can't move around very much, you can go stir crazy real quick. But my mom bought me a guitar, nice little acoustic Gibson guitar, and my older brother Skip, who already had a rock band since 1954, he'd been playing in a rock band, would come by the house and show me some chords. And I didn't have anything else to do, so I really got right on learning the chords. And, you know, at the time, it was 61, and folk music was really happening then with the Kingston Trio and Joan Baez. And then all of a sudden, this skinny little guy named Bob Dylan came along, and he was playing these songs that had such incredible message in the lyrics. And so it was easy for me to kind of become a guitarist musician with really not having it be the intention for a career. Although I was soon to find out from my doctor that my intended career, which would be in the aviation division of the Marine Corps, was not going to be happening because my injuries were so severe that I did not even qualify for entry level into the military, much less into their flight program. So here I was, 17 years old now, and I knew how to play guitar. Skip would come by and show me some more every day or every week, and then he asked me to come out and sit in with his band that he had with Joe Butler, who was in the Air Force out in West Hampton at the time, two of his Air Force buddies, Sonny Botteri and Clay Saunier, my brother Skip, and a saxophone player named King Charles, and they just needed a rhythm guitarist. So I got the job as rhythm guitarist, and then within a month of having bought my beautiful shiny new Les Paul gold top guitar, the bass player, Clay Saunier, announced he was leaving the Air Force, retiring, and going home to not Alabama, to Louisiana, where he was from, and that he said, "Steve, I think you're an ideal candidate for becoming the bass player in the Kingsmen," which is what our band's name was. And so that's how I got into it, as a gig. And I'm the accidental bass player, but I'm really glad I am. I love bass guitar, and I think it's a terrifically important part, more important than most people give it credit in a rock combo. So that's how I got into it.
You mentioned Joe Butler, of course. How was it that the rhythm section of, and by the way, when he says the Kingsmen, folks, he doesn't mean the band that did Louie Louie. That's right. There's a bunch of bands out there called the Kingsmen during the time.
Yeah, there was about a half a dozen at the time that Kingsmen had the hit. So we were the Kingsmen because our sax player and kind of unofficially the band leader, his name was King Charles, and we were the Kingsmen. So that's how we got the name. And fitting in with bass guitar, and it was a steep hill to climb because I had only a month to learn. But it was such a natural instrument for me that I picked it up much faster than I did becoming a rhythm guitarist. And lead guitarist I was never going to be. It just wasn't my personality to play the guitar with those lead lines and all the contorted faces you have to make when you're making those notes. So, yeah, I was very happy being the bass player. And Joe Butler, he was the drummer in the band, but he also would come up front and sing leads, in which case a fellow named Jan Buchner would sit in on the drum kit. And Jan actually had a very big role in the formation of Lovin Spoonful because while we were waiting for Joe to give up his commitment to another record contract he had in 1965, Jan sat in on the drum kit and gave us a place to rehearse out in Long Island in a hotel that he was the manager of and closed for the winter. So we went from hotel to hotel. Hotel was Bill's Head Inn in Bridgehampton. We played our first gig after practicing there with Jan Buchner, and then we went to the Hotel Albert in New York City, where Joe joined up with us in March of 1965.
Well, we haven't mentioned the other two folks. How did you guys hook up with Zal Yahonsky and John Sebastian?
Well, again, in one of those odd occurrences where sort of circumstances took over, I went in about the 15th or maybe the 20th of December, right before Christmas, 1964. I had just returned from a 3-month trip in Europe on motorcycles with my best friend, Peter Davey. And they were waiting for us at a customs dock in New York right around Christmas, December 20th, I think it may have been, or the 19th. Well, on the way into the city, Skip said, "Why don't you come and visit me?" Because he was living in Greenwich Village at the time. "I want you to meet these two guys that are looking for a bass player." So I said, "What do I got to lose?" I took my bass along with me and headed in to pick up my motorcycle. And when I got to Skip's house, he and Joe both gave me directions over to this little club in Greenwich Village. He said, "The two guys are named John and Zolly. They'll be waiting for you there." I trucked on over there, and here were these two crazy-looking guys. One with wild, dark hair and, piercing eyes that kind of just stared right through you. And the other guy was very kind of folky-looking with round, rimless glasses and a T-shirt, dungarees. We played in this funky little club that was called the Cafe Bazaar. Actually, it was at the time it was called the Village Music Hall, but it soon became the Cafe Bazaar right after that. And we jammed for about 2 hours with just two guitars and a bass. There was no drummer there, but we just liked each other so much from the very first meeting that I decided to stay in the city a couple more days to hang out and get to hear. John was going to be playing at this club called the Night Owl with these four guys that were friends of his. One was named Timmy Harden, one was named Freddie Neal, one was Buzzy Linhart, and the other was Felix Pappalardi.
Oh, and all four of them would go on to distinguished rock careers.
Huge. Timmy Harden was one of the premier songwriters of that era that unfortunately died very young. And, of course, Felix went on to form Cream and Mountain. Produced Cream, but he was in the band Mountain.
Yep.
And he died tragically in the 80s in an accident with a gun. And then, of course, Buzzy Linhart was this wild combination drummer, vibraphone player. And at the time, he was John Sebastian's roommate. And then Freddie Neal, what can you say about Freddie Neal? With that warm voice he had and the songs that he wrote, I heard the five of them play, and within 5 minutes, I'm joining up with this guy, John Sebastian. This is just too good an opportunity. And Zolly, on the other hand, was such a great guitar player. I didn't know where it would go, but I told him I'd give it 6 months. I was going to take off another semester from college and give it 6 months. And if it was happening by then, I just wouldn't go back to college at all. And almost oddly enough, it was just about exactly 6 months when we hit the road to promote Do You Believe in Magic.
One thing that's in your book that I guess most people may know, you went through some interesting processes to get a record contract, as you were first considering Elektra Records and ended up on a rather offbeat choice, namely Kama Sutra. How did that happen?
Well, it was a choice of kind of like made by market reasoning. And the market reasoning was in 1964, 1965, all the music that kids were listening to was on AM radio. There was very little. FM was just beginning to get popular. It featured mostly classical and jazz. There was no stereo was not being made. So all of the records that were coming out that kids would hear before they would buy the album would be a 45 single, and it would be on AM radio. And getting your song on the AM radio was the key to success. That's how the Beatles became popular. That's how the Stones became popular. And when we were looking for a record deal with Do You Believe in Magic as our leading candidate for our first record, Elektra Records, who was a label that featured folk bands, that was their primary artist, were folk artists, came to us, and Jack Holtzman knew John Sebastian personally from growing up in the village. And his producer, Paul Rothschild, was a friend of John's, and Eric Jacobson, our producer, knew all of them. We had all the respect in the world for Elektra Records because they put out quality albums by Joan Baez and others of the folk era that were artists we really respected a lot. So on one hand, we had Elektra Records, who was highly respected. We liked the owner of the company. We liked the lead producer. And then on the other hand, we had this notion of how are we going to get exposure if we can't get a record on the AM radio. Elektra Records couldn't do it. They didn't have the kind of people on staff that knew how to break a record on AM radio. Kama Sutra, on the other hand, was owned by three guys from Brooklyn that their entire career had been breaking records for a variety of record companies onto AM radio. They wouldn't know an album from a ton of bricks on their head, but singles, they knew how to sell singles. And so when it came down to decision time, all the major record labels had passed on us for one reason only. And that one reason was that the band doesn't have an English accent. Now, I know that sounds odd today, but believe me, when Joe Smith, who was chairman of Warner Brothers at the time, came to see the band live at the Night Owl, he loved it. He loved the music. He told Bob Cabela, this music is tremendous. I could get it on the radio in a minute, but without them speaking with British accents, they won't be able to compete with the British invasion. And, you know, he was a smart guy. He wasn't saying something ridiculous. It probably was true in the big picture. But in the small picture, these guys from Brooklyn and their friends and their fathers and people that knew the record industry, they knew they could get Do You Believe in Magic on the radio. And then after that, it would just be the strength of the band's ability to produce more single records. And we knew that we had more good songs coming. And so when it came time to make the choice, it was the choice of which company can get us on AM radio. And at that point in time, there was no choice. We decided to go with Kama Sutra, even though in hindsight, always being 2020, we may have been better off in the long run to have gone with Elektra, but it probably would have been a lot slower process of getting our music as popular as it was so quickly. Remember, we had our first 7 releases all went to the top 10. And that was almost unprecedented for its time, for any group to come from nobody's ever heard of them to first 7 releases all making top 10. So, you know, you can say when you look back 40 years later, which was the smart move. I still think going with the singles label was the smart move. However, I think what hurt us later in our career was that Kama Sutra didn't know how to market albums. And by the end of 1965, early 1966, the albums were starting to replace singles as the most important sales tool. And Sgt. Pepper's, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, a couple other albums came out that were groundbreaking and deservedly so, high-quality albums, but they were geared at FM radio and where somebody could play a 6-minute song. On AM radio, you couldn't play a song more than 3 minutes and a few seconds. You just wouldn't get it on the air. So it's easy to look back and be a Monday morning quarterback, you know, but we wanted to get our songs on the radio, and that was the way we thought it was best to do it, and that's the choice we made. So, you know, you live with what choices you make.
Well, in many ways it worked out pretty well. You were talking about 1965. During that year, you got to meet your idol, Bob Dylan, and I gather from your book you're pretty sure that's you on Maggie's Farm, right?
If it's not the actual recording, it's somebody came into the studio and copied the part I was playing note for note, because I have a pretty unique style. And when Bob asked me to play, it was on 3 cuts, actually. And I can't remember the third one, but the second one was Positively 4th Street. I, like I said, have a unique style. When I hear Maggie's Farm, I can close my eyes and I can almost hear myself playing every one of those notes. Now, there's a giant controversy if you go into the famous internet chat rooms where they know everything there is to know about everything. There was one chat room whose name will go unmentioned because they were so wrong, that claimed I never even played on a Bob Dylan session. And were so sure of themselves that they were being very smug about it. You know, we have absolute inside information, and Steve Boone never played on a Dylan session until all of a sudden somebody produced a pay stub from Columbia Records that happened to be coincidental of me being at the Columbia recording studio the same night Bob Dylan was. So that put a squash to that everybody that knows everything about everything club. But I try to stay away from those discussion groups because, like I said, I don't know everything about everything, and I'm way over my head if I want to pretend I do.
Well, you mentioned earlier the fact that you guys cranked out so many songs during that period, and a lot of them, of course, were by John Sebastian. But one of the myth busters that I really liked about your book is that many people think of the Lovin Spoonful as John Sebastian and 3 amiable sidemen. But it really was a band. You guys played your own instruments in the studio. You wrote your own songs. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a sore point, and by no means are we like, hey, we played our own music. But in the early 1960s, the record companies in the studio were the playground of the producers and the songwriters. The producers would bring in the high-quality studio musicians. The songwriter would provide, usually not being one of the group, they'd come from Tin Pan Alley or 1650 Broadway, which was where all the professional songwriters had their offices. And then they would bring in the artist just to sing over the tracks that were already recorded, and the producer would finish it up by mixing it and getting it ready for airplay. With the Beatles coming in and with the new era springing out of the folk music movement, the artist was starting to write their own songs, and the record companies, with a few exceptions, were still not ready to let them play on the record. So most groups had to stand aside, even though they were writing their songs, and let the studio musicians do the playing. But with us, and with our connection with this label that specialized in singles, one of the things we insisted on was having A, our own producer, Eric Jacobson, and B, being able to play on all of our records, all of the parts, drums, bass, guitars, overdubs, vocals, and even participating in the mix if we wanted to. And we stuck to it as one of our core principles because we wanted to have that energy that the band would develop on stage in a live performance transfer to our records in the studio, so that when somebody heard the Lovin Spoonful on AM radio, they could come to our concert and they'd hear the same level of energy. And that was real important to us. So that's why we were insistent on being one of the few groups that were allowed or let by the record company to play on all of the hits, all of the records, with very few. We had a couple of top-level guys come in and do a few tracks for us, but 99% of our stuff was done by the 4 original members, and then when Jerry joined, he chipped in on his share too.
Now, I mentioned earlier that John was best known for writing many of the hits, but he didn't write them all. In fact, the one we started off this conversation with, "You Didn't Have to Be So Nice," that was your song, right?
That's right. I had experimented with songwriting when I was sitting on that couch recovering from my accident. And at the time, most of my influences were too hard, too complicated as songs for me to learn, so I instead learned some of the real simple, what I called beach party songs, like Michael Rowe, The Boat Ashore, and, the Kingston Trio songs. The songs I was writing, what it did give me was a sense of melody, because I understood how to transfer melody to a series of chord changes. And my lyrics were terrible. They were just corny and sappy and not very well constructed. But what I did start doing with the Spoonful was we always would have a piano around somewhere. So I had taken piano lessons for a little bit, maybe a couple of years when I was a youngster, and then I always noodled around on the piano because I knew how to make chords. And when you've got a piano to play on, you really hear a much richer sound when you play a chord. So the melodies became clearer. And also I started to get this little gift I had where melodies and words would appear in my mind. And this sounds kind of hippy-dippy, but almost like by magic, I would hear this phrase. And one of the phrases I heard, and it kind of was connected with this, John and Zal tried to fix me up with one of their friends, this girl from Toronto named Norite Wild. And while we met and we liked each other, we never became boyfriend and girlfriend. It was just one of those kind of, didn't click. Nice person, but just not, not for each other romantically. And I had this phrase in my head, you didn't have to be so nice, I would have liked you anyway. And that became the germination of a song that as I listened to it over and over again and played on a piano, I came up with a melody line. And then working on that, I got to a bridge line. And then I took it to John and said, John, we've got this structure for a song, got a melody, we got the makings of a full verse and chorus, and help me finish it. And he did, and we got almost immediately into the studio with it, because Magic was on the charts, and it was time to record a new single, and it worked perfectly with the auto harp, which was proving to be very popular with the fans. They loved seeing the auto harp on the early Do You Believe in Magic shows. So we got to use an auto harp again, and it was really a well-received song. And still to this day, I get tremendous compliments about that song. But John was very generous in his helping me getting it finished. And we became kind of a songwriting team there for the first year, where we finished a couple of songs of mine, and I would help him out with some songs he was working on, and so it worked out really good. And of course, in 1965 and 66, the band was like a Swiss clock. We were just clicking on all 8 cylinders. I'm throwing metaphors all out here, all around, like Swiss clocks and 8-cylinder engine. But the band really was. Up until the summer of 1966, we were almost unstoppable. Having that behind me as my first success, I now felt empowered to continue to write new songs. And did. And it was something that I wish I had kept going. There was reasons why I sort of tapered off it after a while, but for the first couple of years, I was very gung-ho about writing my own songs.
And in the book, folks, you can hear lots of inside stories into Spoonful songs and all kinds of rock and roll anecdotes, like about the band at Shea Stadium with the fans recognizing them, which kind of chased them backstage. One that threw me was they almost wanted you to be the Monkees, right?
Yeah, they did. Right after Magic was a hit, and it was already coming back down the charts, and we knew you didn't have to be so nice, get ready to hit the charts again. And Bob Cavallo called the band, our manager Bob Cavallo called the band for a meeting and said, got these 2 producers want to talk to you, and we've arranged a meeting this afternoon, and let's head over there. So we went over to this office, and 2 producer guys, TV producers, pitched us with this idea for a band, 4-piece band, that would be kind of patterned after the Beatles, with the funny guy, the good-looking guy, the tall, quiet guy, and the musical genius guy kind of thing. And it sounded good. They were backed by, it looked like, significant people were supporting the idea, and they had connections that were good. And then came the zinger, what was really the deal breaker for us. We want you to change your name to the Monkees. And it wasn't that the Monkees was a bad name, but we'd already had a hit record as the Lovin Spoonful. Why do we need to change our name? Why can't we just have it stay as the Lovin Spoonful? But they didn't want that. They had a marketing idea in their head, and it's going to be the Monkees. And so when we realized they weren't going to change and we weren't going to change, it was just like, let's pass on the deal. And I'm not, it turned out to be a hit television show, and everybody did well, but supposing it hadn't, and we gave up our name. So it was a gamble, and I'm glad we took the gamble and stuck with the Lovin Spoonful.
Now, as time went along, of course, the hits kind of started to slow down a little bit. There's one controversy that you address in the book that I guess you knew far more about than I ever even heard about, but it was you and Zal and drug bust. Can you talk a little bit, without getting into great detail, because people could read about it in the book, but how that contributed to the dissolution of the Spoonful?
Yeah, it certainly did. And I will try to keep it there. It's a book in itself if you examine the fine details. But Zal and I got busted one night in a rent-a-car. Had just picked up the rent-a-car, attended a party, picked up a small bag of weed, was driving back to our hotel, got stopped by the police, the car got searched. Next morning we had to spend the night in jail, bailed out. Next morning or we hired a lawyer. And then this was the era when no other group had ever been busted for pot of any degree at all that had a name already, that already was successful. This was before Keith Boone. This is before the Beatles got busted in Japan. This is before anybody so nobody at the record company or our management had a playbook for how to deal with it. So the very first thing we happened after getting out of jail, we go into our attorney's office, who was a very famous at the time attorney, and instead of reading us, and then there was these two strangers in the room who we didn't know, but turned out they were a police chief and a district attorney. And instead of reading us what was our potential rights, he read us what our liabilities were. And he said, because Zali is a Canadian citizen, that he will be deported tomorrow morning, and the chances of him getting back in the country are virtually nil. Now, there was no mention of, was the arrest illegal? Was the search and seizure illegal? Was the stop in the first place illegal? Because I was doing nothing wrong. I wasn't speeding, didn't go through a stop sign. I had a rent-a-car. Long story short is it ended very badly. And in May of 1966, we made a deal to keep Zali in the country, and it did not end well. And as I tell in the book, the reasons it did not end well are not because we had bad intentions. And in fact, San Francisco, the police department made a deal with us, which they did not honor. And it was very disappointing. I say, and I make the point in the book, that the Lovin Spoonful really only existed as a well-oiled record-making machine for 1 year. From May of 1965, when we finally got our record deal in May of 65, till May of 1966, just before Summer in the City came out, we couldn't make a bad move. But then the bust happened at the end of May, and I make a point in the book that from that point on, the band, and especially Zali and me's downward spiral, and then eventually led to him leaving the band, and another couple of years of touring, but it wasn't nearly with the energy that it had in that first year. And all the things that we created up to that point, Summer in the City being a hit, our first two albums, they were all done before the bust. And then after that, the records we made were great records. Hum's the Lovin Spoonful and Everything Playing. Both had their very fine moments to them, but you could feel that the air was ever so slowly leaking out of the balloon. And I go into it in detail, great detail in the book, because it's a story worth telling. If it had happened a year later, every record company and every management company would have had a playbook on how to deal with this, and it would have come out entirely differently. But because they didn't, and they didn't know how to handle it, the results were not nearly so good. In a word, they were bad.
Yeah, because we're kind of running out of time here, how do we summarize the aftermath? I mean, people can read the book and read about John leaving the band and Jerry Yester coming in, and but then after that, you kind of had a dangerous couple decades there, didn't you?
Yeah, Jerry came in and finished the album up, Everything Playing. It was a tremendous addition to the band, but I think by that point the writing was on the wall, And I left the band before Revelation Evolution was made, and took a crack at producing an album for Mercury Records. It didn't do well, but then I headed for what my heart was, just to get away from everything and the attention of the bust and everything. I bought a sailboat, lived in the Caribbean for 3.5 years, and then moved back to the States, and then got into a high seas smuggling operation, transporting boatloads of marijuana from Colombia into the States. And it was like the pirate movies I saw as a kid, and it wasn't like we were bloodthirsty pirates, but we were out on the high seas, and I think history's going to treat this era very poorly when it comes to seeing good, honest, hard-working citizens getting locked up for smoking a relatively harmless plant matter that's much less harmless than, say, tobacco is in terms of damage to the body. And I didn't feel really that I didn't like breaking the law in hindsight, and I got caught. And at the end of the day, you can read about it in the book. It's an exciting 3 years that we were doing this, and the retelling of the story is fantastic. I paid my price, I did my time and paid my fine, as they say. And ever since then, I've been just doing my thing with the band in reunion of 1991. Been playing Lovin Spoonful dates, 15, 20, 25 a year. And I think the era of the smuggling operations were tremendous excitement. I look back on it very fondly. Did I like breaking the law? No. Who does? But I do think that marijuana eventually will be legal the same way that alcohol is today. And I think if I had to make my choice over what's a safer recreational drug, I'd pick pot every time. But that's my opinion. People are entitled to their own opinions about it. But that's how I look at it.
Well, again, there's so many stories, folks, we could get into about the various reunions that have happened over the years. But I guess the bottom line really is that you, Joe, and Sherry Yester are still doing it. Is there any music coming out, or is it strictly going to be live appearances?
Well, we want to make a record. Joe has just finished writing a Broadway play, and he has 12 songs that accompany it. I've got a half a dozen songs that I can't wait to get recorded. And Jerry has a bunch of songs that he and his writing partner have come up with. Trying to find a record label that will put up the cash to make it. We could always do a basement recording, but if we're going to really do a good one, it needs to have a budget and a record label behind it that's willing to take a chance on the fact that we're in our 70s and 60s, and our audience is in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Do they still buy music, or do they just not bother and just play their old records? What tells me they still do is when we go and play our shows nowadays, the audiences are always asking us, when are you going to bring out a new record? I hear that so often in the autograph line that I can't even, I would say it's the most often heard comment other than great show, we loved your show tonight. It's like, when are we going to hear some new music? And we do one new song in the show that Jerry and Joe wrote, and it's always well received. So I think the answer to your question is, if any of us were independently wealthy and could afford to bankroll something like this, there would already have been one made. But next year is our 50th anniversary. And Joe and I were just talking. That's why when he called in and I had to take his call, we're talking right now about how we're going to plan to deal with the 50th anniversary of the band next year. And then one of the major topics are making a recording that will be our statement, that will be the lasting statement of the 50th anniversary, one that can go on beyond the live performances.
Well, that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I just, like I say, I wish that I had more financial deep pockets where I could step up. Or I'm sure all of us feel that way. And we haven't gotten rich by doing this touring, but we've gotten rich in experience from, meeting people, and especially Vietnam vets that would come up and say, lying in a foxhole with bullets flying over my head and being able to whistle "What a Day for a Daydream" got me through a year in Nam. So those kind of comments make it all worthwhile. And I love playing the shows for those specific people that have those kind of memories. And it's very worthwhile, believe me. It's such a reward for us that, you almost feel like getting paid for something you should just be glad you get a chance to do.
Well, before we go out, I guess we got to address the elephant in the room. Is there going to be a role for Mr. Sebastian in any of this?
Well, the door has always been open for John, and I hope that he would say, I think I'm going to throw in with you guys. Where can I find a place to? And there's plenty of room for his guitar playing, his auto harp playing, his certainly his rhythm guitar work. He's one of the things that John is not well known for, and he's one of the best in the country is as a rhythm guitarist, which, most people think rhythm guitar is like I say, right field for a bass player. Nobody hits it out there. Rhythm guitar is an overlooked skill, but it's the essential guitar part on a record. Leads come and go. They come in, they go out, they come in, they go out. The rhythm guitar is really the heart and soul of a record, along with the rhythm section. So I would love to have John be part of it. He knows he's always welcome. He's been told that in more ways than one. And it's going to be up to John to make the decision he wants to. To date, he hasn't shown any interest in doing it. And one of his sayings that I like a whole lot is that I say no until I say yes. So we'll see. Like I said, the door is always open for him. We'd love to have him come up on stage, and I know the fans would. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that.
All righty. Well, with that, folks, you heard about the Lovin Spoonful past, present, and maybe a bit about the future.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Don't forget that all past shows are archived on the Artist First Radio Network. And join us next week for another exciting episode of Flashback.